In this video, I'll be taking a look at Crash Bandicoot Warped, developed by Naughty Dog for the PlayStation and released in 1998. Since Crash 2 and 3 are so similar, however, this video will be unscripted. I'll just be looking at elements of the game as they come up off the top of my head. If you're looking for a more structured analysis of the Crash Bandicoot formula, my videos on Crash 1 and 2 are better places to start. Crash 3 begins with the evil twin of the health power-up escaping imprisonment and tracking down Cortex. After his previous defeats, Cortex has enlisted the help of Dr. Entropy, whose time travel machine will allow the villains to collect the power crystals in a time period before Crash collected them in Crash 2. It's a novel setup and the most clever plot the series has had, but upon beginning the first level it becomes immediately clear what the real reason for the time travel theme was. There's no forests in Crash 3, no rivers or factories or Arctic environments. Instead, this time we have medieval castles, prehistoric volcanoes, the Sphinx, and a Blade Runner-esque futuristic metropolis. The time travel framing device allows the developers to create completely new environmental designs, varying wildly from what they'd worked on in Crash 1 and 2. It keeps the game feeling fresh even as we head into the third installment. The game perhaps doesn't get off to a particularly great start, with the second level being a swimming section. Swimming mechanics get a lot of flack in games, but in this case I see it as just another variant on the gameplay like we've been seeing throughout the last two games. These levels aren't much fun and the controls aren't great, but there's only two of them, so they can be written off as a failed attempt to vary the gameplay, and nothing needs to be said beyond that. The auto-run levels return, but a lot has changed. You're playing as Coco now, riding on a tiger cub, but it's the setting that really elevates these levels beyond what we'd seen in Crash 1 and 2. Running across the Great Wall of China as it's being built is a great idea just conceptually, but it also allows the developers to create some remarkably believable obstacles. It makes sense that if you did run along the Great Wall of China while it was being built, you probably would have to avoid people carrying buckets. There probably would be some barrels up there. It's a fantastic marriage of environmental design and level design to create the best auto-run levels in the series. The chase stages return. This time Crash is running from a dinosaur, and the obstacles are telegraphed a little better this time, giving the player more time to react and rectifying a problem I had with Crash 2. This particular level goes from a chase section to a 2D section to a behind the back section, back to 2D, and then back to a chase before the finish. This is probably the most variation in perspective in a single level in the entire series. There's nothing strictly new here, but it goes to show how developers can combine familiar concepts to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The jet ski levels can feel a little out of place. Wave Race 64 came out in '96, and Naughty Dog obviously wanted to try their hand at water physics in their PlayStation 1 engine. The developers were clearly getting a bit restless and wanted to stretch their programming legs. The bosses are better in Crash 3, partly due to the fact that they trash talk Crash and the player every few levels. This gives them just a little bit of character and gives the player even more reason to want to take them down. It's only ever a few sentences, but it means that the bosses don't show up out of nowhere like they did in the previous games. There's about as many of these cutscenes in Crash 3 as there were hologram interludes in Crash 2. It goes to show that the amount of cutscenes in Crash 2 wasn't the problem, it was that the plot didn't have enough going on to justify the amount of dialogue. I think it's fair to say that Crash 3 has the best plot in the series, even if that's not saying much by the standards of cartoony platformers from the 90s. The Middle Eastern levels see the welcome return of the climbing grates. Again, these grates are a great inclusion because of how seamlessly they integrate with Crash's controls. You just jump on and you're good to go. There's no transitionary period or drastic change in the control scheme like there is with, say, Crash 2's jetpack or Crash 3's own jet ski and swimming levels. It all just meshes very well. The first motorbike race shows up, and at least at this point, it's a fair distraction. I have to wonder if the desire to make these levels or to make Crash Team Racing came first. But either way, it's more evidence of Naughty Dog being bored and wanting to do something completely drastically different. If you ask me, Dingodile is the best boss in the series thus far. He's not complex and he's clearly still designed to be beaten by children, but his patterns do require at least some thought, and it's interesting that approaching him to hit him is still dangerous even when he's stunned. Strangely, there's only 2 chase levels this time around, which is a bit of a shame because if the developers had been able to create another environment as compelling as the Great Wall, the game could only have benefited. Now, I talked at length about controls in the first 2 Crash videos, and I do have to come back to this point for Crash 3. This time, Crash has been given a little more weight to his jumps. It makes him feel just a little bit heavier in midair, and as a result, tight jumps are a little more difficult. It's nowhere near as bad as in Crash 1, and I can see why Naughty Dog wanted to make this change. In Crash 2, Crash could sometimes feel just a little bit weightless. The way I see it though, this is only a regression. It prioritizes the aesthetic feel of the controls over their practical usefulness. The second motorbike level pops up here, and I have to draw the line with this. This level is simply too difficult. No player should be required to master a racing minigame to continue playing the 3D platformer they paid money for. I have to imagine that many young children back in '98 couldn't beat this level and had to give up on the game. Making the player complete such a difficult minigame that has nothing to do with the base gameplay just to progress is not a good test of skill. Crash has been gaining new moves with each boss beaten. The belly flop is self-explanatory, but the double jump and extended spin glide moves have some potential. The game's design doesn't really change to accommodate these though, and they end up mostly being safety nets for missed jumps. They're generally very situational and are mostly reserved for bonus 2.5D sections. It's a shame because the late game could have designed more challenges around these new moves to keep the game feeling fresh, for both the player and the developers designing the levels. The aerial dogfights are the weakest and most bare bones of the new gameplay variants, and it's where Naughty Dog starts to lose the plot with throwaway mechanics. Considering the effort that must have gone into developing Naughty Dog's engine for these levels, it's ridiculous and kind of amazing in a way that they get thrown out after 1 or 2 appearances. But you could certainly make the argument, and I probably would, that this time would have been better spent making more traditional Crash levels. There's some impressive level of detail effects in the next jet ski level, and as a side note, Spyro the Dragon came out in '98 and was the first game to make heavy use of level of detail on the PlayStation. Coincidence? The first future level has an impressive cityscape background which Naughty Dog isn't afraid to show off with swooping camera angles during level transitions. The amount of modelling and detail stretching into the background here is quite impressive, and while you could again argue that this is a waste of development time, it shows what Naughty Dog were prioritising in making these big, graphically impressive environments. There's an enemy in this level that makes the double jump useful, which is a rarity, but even then the only part of the level that actually requires it is the 2D bonus stage. The rising water gimmick in this Egyptian pyramid level is something fairly inventive, at least by series standards. And again, the double jump is fairly useful on the sarcophagus enemies. With those two enemies being the only situations where the double jump is particularly useful, I think it's fair to say that the game wasn't designed with the double jump in mind. The engine boss is a much more impressive implementation of the dogfight mechanic, and I get the impression this is what Naughty Dog were going for with Crash 2's final boss. It doesn't use the base gameplay mechanics, but it's extremely visually impressive, especially for the PlayStation 1. Flying over the surface of the moon while fighting a giant mech in space is probably the most impressive visual in the entire series. The spectacle is turned up to 11 here, and since this isn't the final boss, it's forgivable that the developers needed to use the dogfight mechanic to make it work. There's a small change made to Crash 3 that the player might notice at this point. The warp rooms are all now accessible from one central hub. This isn't anything major, but it's one of those nice little streamlining changes that can be made to a sequel, especially when you're up to the third game in a series. Crash now gets the Wumper Bazooka, which is put to one-off use in a bonus stage and is never particularly useful again, which is again disappointing, but I've said my piece on the new moves. There's one more bike race and one more dog fight before the end. I've said my piece on those as well, so I'm just going to acknowledge them and move on. Before the final level, there's a secret jet ski level, which is impressively open-ended and has you essentially looking for an item to open the level exit. Perhaps this was a sign of things to come from Naughty Dog. The final level tributes the flashlight mechanic from the previous games, and has a cathartic moment near the end where the game gives you 3 health power-ups at the same time, or in other words, invincibility. This is the only time in the entire series that this happens, and it's an excellent way to send off the Crash gameplay. The game ends with a serviceable boss fight against Cortex while the two masks duke it out in the foreground. It doesn't quite match the spectacle of the first game's final boss, but it's far better than the second's since it tests the player on the base gameplay mechanics. Even if Cortex's pattern is a little simplistic and predictable. Crash 3 lives and dies on gameplay variety. Roughly half the game is made up of swimming, racing, dogfighting and jet skiing. All completely new systems that show Naughty Dog were getting antsy to try something new. If you came for a Crash game, you might come away feeling underserved when compared to Crash 2, which had a total of 4 gimmicky levels. What little of the Crash formula is here is probably the best it's ever been. It's just a shame that the other half of the game is a bunch of tech demos for Naughty Dog's engine. It was clearly time to move on.